We welcome Mr. Subhashan Garg, former finance secretary, columnist, writer, and author to Business World post budget discussion. Thank you so much, sir, for joining Business World on this post budget discussion. So, your first thoughts, sir, of course, you have been busy in various television studios commenting on the union budget. What are your first thoughts on the union budget, sir, now that we can have probably a more considered view on the entire budget exercise?
See, the budget has been fairly good on fiscal metrics, in the sense that the projections of revenue and expenditures are quite realistic. There are no off-budget borrowings. Whatever is there is transparently available on the budget. Government has also been keen in sort of advancing the capital expenditures. So there is a hefty increase on the budget side on the capital expenditure. So these are good positives which I see from the budget. But then there are lots of things which you go into a little deeper and then you realize. For example, let me just take the capital expenditure. So the capex still this year, like last year, partly builds on substituting the capex of the public sector enterprises. For example, this year, the IRFC, Indian Railway Finance Corporation, which used to borrow from the market something close to about 45,000 crore and fund the engines and the other locomotives and the assets of the railways, will not be borrowing next year. And instead, the government will provide increased capex support to the railways. So to that extent, the headline increase in the capex is not real to that extent. But that doesn't take away that if there is 33% increase, you still have some increase, about 15% or 16% or so, with the rest being sort of substituted. One concern which I have is continued high fiscal deficit in the country. This year also for 22, 23, 24, the government is keeping fiscal deficit of 5.9% of GDP. And the GDP, as you know, in last 2 years have grown thanks to the inflation and all. So on a higher base, you will go for borrowing of roughly about 18 lakh crore. That adds to the fiscal vulnerability of the government, thanks to the high debt and consequently the higher interest burden. So you would have noticed the interest burden goes up by as much as 1.4 lakh crores in a year. So I don't think this is very much in the interest of the country to maintain such high order of fiscal deficit. We must have attempted a much bigger consolidation than what has been attempted. And the last, I think I would, in my initial reactions to what you ask, what worries me is the practical abandonment of the privatization and the disinvestment program. The government is projecting only about 51,000 crores of the disinvestment receipts next year. Some of that comes from selling the shares which this special undertaking SUTI holds, like the shares of Axis Bank, and some of them like the Balco and Hindustan Zinc, that kind of share which is still there. This tells me that practically there would be very little chance of privatizing any of the big ticket items like Concor and the IDBI and things. If it happens, it's good, but the way things stand, so that worries me. Like, why is the monetization program which government announced with a lot of fanfare, that 6 lakh crore is practically not moving. So this year we had only probably one major transaction. On the road side, the NHAI did one, but otherwise there is hardly any movement. So these are my initial thoughts. I think there would be questions on the taxation side, etc. So I'm not making that observation at this stage. Thank you.
So I'll come to that in a bit. In fact, just before the show, I was talking to Swadeshi Jagan Manch, Mr. Ashwini Mahajan. So I guess there is some correlation with the disinvestment exercise as well. Now, I would like to begin with something which is very close to your heart. Like you wrote about 10 billion. Sort of 5 trillion, 10 trillion, you wrote the book. And then, of course, we revised the target to 5 trillion. And now we talk about India being a developed economy, a high income economy by 2047. So do you think that given that context, this budget is well placed to sort of take India to another trajectory altogether, to a high income category country by 2047? And of course, in due course, 5 trillion, 10 trillion economy as well.
So that is the national ambition, be a developed country by 2047, be a $10 trillion economy by 2035, be a $5 trillion economy by 26-27. I think that's the, so there is no replacement or substitution of the target. I think we should see these in a continuum, a short term, medium term, and the long term kind of thing. These ambitions will require a very high growth rates to be generated in the country. So in the domestic economy, we should have 8 to 9% of the average growth for this much period to generate this kind of outcome. And in dollar terms, we should be growing at about 10 to 12% per annum. If you want to reach out to attain these levels. Now, the government has projected in the economic survey 6.5% of the growth, and the nominal growth taken into account in the budget is 10.5%. So if you factor in the dollar depreciation of about 4% for the year, that will give you dollar growth rate of also about 6.5%. So a 6.5% rate of growth is much lower than attaining these high ambitious goals in the time frame in which it is mentioned. So I see the growth impulses in the economy is slowing down. This year we grew by about 7%, though we had projected in the economic survey last year of 8 to 8.5%. And this year we are growing or next year we are expected to grow only by 6.5%. That may also not turn out to be true, because the underlying impulses may bring the growth to about 6% or less. So to respond specifically to your question, I think those targets should keep on guiding us, but we'll have to perform much better than what we are doing in case we have a good or realistic chance of achieving it.
Sure. Now, in the run-up to the budget, there was speculation whether it would be a populist budget, considering that it's an election eve budget. So in the budget announcements, we saw that some middle class concerns probably were addressed, but there were other voices that probably much more could have been done. Now, there were other reactions that, well, it's a pragmatic budget, although not a very populist budget, etc. So do you think the middle class, which is a great constituency for the government, for any government for that matter, especially in the run-up to 9 state elections and the Lok Sabha election, do you think the core middle class, their concerns have been addressed, be it the income tax slabs, be it other concerns of the middle class?
So the governments come back by getting elected, and the elections are by receiving the votes from the people, and therefore populism, in whatever connotations people use it, is to impress this large body of electorates to vote you back into the power. That's what populism. There is no good definition of what is middle class and what is the lower class and what is the rich class. But let us take it as the poor or the vulnerable as something close to where we provide the free food grains, or we provide to the farmers the assistance in the form of MSP purchases, the input subsidies, as well as PM Kisan. So this is a large segment. Their needs had been addressed before the budget. So their need had been addressed before the budget by you rationalizing or sort of replacing the food security scheme by a free PM Ann Yojana, which is a free, and the farmer subsidies, etc., also continue. So the segment of the poor relatively was addressed prior to the budget. Now the middle class, which is, let's say, above this, or about the 5 to 7 crore people who file, let us say, income tax returns, whether they pay it or not is a different one. So if for this is also a large segment. If 7 crore population, you multiply by 4, you take about 28 to 30 crore people, and they are also a large segment. They were expecting that there would be some relief on the taxation front. I think that has been answered. So you have 5 to 7 lakh slab where the up to 7 lakh you don't have to pay any tax. There is also some tweaking in the new income tax regime, where if you don't claim certain exemptions, you get much smaller tax incidence. That has also been tweaked in favor of that. So I think middle class has got something. No one will ever be fully satisfied, but the impact which the finance minister said about of these concessions is about 35,000 crore rupees. So that is the one which has been sort of done to address the middle class. So my sense is that given the constraint of the government in terms of the resources it has very relatively smaller tax resources, and it was borrowing, as I said earlier, heavily. You can't expand this kind of borrowings to do this kind of expenditures more and more. Given those constraints, I think government has done more than adequately to address both the poor and the middle class.
Lastly, sir, our show is a 15-minute capsule that we are running in the post-budget discussions. So, the government has come out with a new Saptarishi paradigm in which startups have a very important role. At the same time, India aspires to become a manufacturing hub, green growth, green energy, etc. So, do you think there's a idea to turn India into a manufacturing hub, which will take care of our job requirements to a great extent? Do you think that thinking to have shaped budget to a great extent?
I'm afraid on this, I don't see that kind of vision. We should be grounded in reality. The manufacturing growth in the current year is only 2%. That's very low growth, despite the elevated capital expenditures of 7.5 lakh crores, which was done last year. And there were a lot of infrastructure and other programs we presented in the last year's budget as well. The notions like this Saptarishi, I think, are more like words. They're not plans, they are not investments, they are not. So you need to get into more specific things underlying them. For example, you mentioned about the startups. Now, startups have done well in the country, and there's a lot of enthusiasm in the young community. They're trying to sort of digitalize commerce, fintech, and other kind of things. That ecosystem is supported by the government by allowing the set of tax-free treatment for a certain number of years. And also giving them certain exemptions from the gift kind of tax which is there. Now that regime is being increased year to year. I don't see this making a great sense. How can a startup be motivated if you are not sure that whether this regime will continue next year or not? And then looking for year to year, I don't really see why we are doing. If you want to nurture this startup, we can say that for 20 years next, this would be the kind of thing, so that these guys are sort of quite assured. There is another change which seems to have been made where until now, the foreign contribution or foreign investments in the startups was not subject to this tax in section 54, where any addition, when you raise the next round of capital, if there is a higher share value, you pay tax on the earlier capital gains, right? And that is what was bringing in the money in the country. Now they are also being subjected to tax. So they would have to file all those kind of returns to claim, and their ease of doing business would get certainly much more affected. And in many cases, they may not get the advantage. So I think we should move beyond the words and see the real action. So I didn't find anything except that capital expenditure, which, as I said last year, did not translate into the real growth. So we may hope that this year's, because the nature of that capex, we can go some other time into those details, is such that it actually just does not generate much growth in the manufacturing sector. So I think we will have to keep our expectations muted in that front.
Lastly, to round up, what would your prescription be so as to ensure that we see enough of job opportunities being created, and so as to absorb the annual addition to the workforce, they are provided with gainful quality jobs so as to ensure that India benefits from its demographic dividend?
See, for that, I think we'll have to first accept some of the fundamental truths which may not be very pleasant. Number one, the jobs are created in the private sector, not in the government. Government is not a great businessman. You look at even the public sector banks now have lesser number of employees than the private sector banks, which has lesser amount of the share of the loans as well as the assets. So if we can accept this and not look for creating as a society and as well as a government that the jobs are created in the government, that's one thing we should accept. Second thing we should accept is that the private sector creates job when it makes investments into new goods and services. And the services are the real employment creators. The goods production, the manufacturing has increasingly become so much automated that it does not generate the real jobs. So if we can accept that the manufacturing is not the real employment creator, the services are the employment creator, and then go around and make our policies, whether it's for travel, education, health, foreign supply of labor and others, then you would be able to get the right kind of impetus for the employment, not harping on the old theory that the manufacturing will generate jobs. By the way, it's not only the new entrants to the employment market or the job market. We need to effect a very major change or transition from the enormous overemployment in agriculture to the non-agriculture. We have too many people trapped in the agriculture. So we need to create a very new ecosystem.
So, good afternoon, everybody. We're here to discuss this post-budget discussion, the provisions that were announced yesterday by the finance minister related to green growth. Now, obviously, the industry has by and large welcomed the budget in terms of striking the right balance between growth and fiscal prudence. And while direct taxation proposals caught all attention during the day, during the speech, majority of the speech was around the 7 priority areas that she listed, and one of them was green growth. Now, obviously, green growth didn't only include provisions related to green energy, but around biodiversity conservation as well this time. But we'll be discussing the provisions related to green energy. So, in your opening comments, all panelists, if you could, throw your light on what's your reading of the provisions under the green growth for green energy, and how much are in the line with the net zero targets, and how much of it has given that impetus. Srivatsan Iyer-ji, if you could start.
Sure thing. Thank you, Arjun, and thanks for having me on this panel. I think first thing to note is it is very encouraging to see that green growth was one of the 7 pillars identified by the government. So that itself, I think, is a reason for optimism going forward. And I think the finance minister in her speech also mentioned that future growth has to be based on sustainable principles. Compared to, I'd say, the last few years, while there were not a whole lot of list of specific incentives or subsidies built in for green, there are a few, and I'll probably list those. But I think what I also see encouraging is there's been a push towards ease of doing business, which I think has been one of the barriers in the evolution of the renewable energy and the green sector anyway. For example, reduction of almost 40,000 compliances,
Right.
And in India, a whole lot of these regulatory provisions have criminal offenses related to them, and they've started to decriminalize many of them. Of course, there's been a lot of PLI support given over the last few years for manufacturing for the renewable energy sector. In this budget, we didn't expect to see a whole lot, and there weren't many, of course. But we have to take into note that the National Hydrogen Mission recently announced almost 20,000 crores for green hydrogen going forward. I think the interesting thing is going to be the details around those. Good to see the investment announced for Ladakh, for example. I think that's something that's been held up for a while. And if that can be pushed a little bit, I think that would really help. And I think the big announcement was this 35,000 crores, right? That's been given towards what was broadly called the energy transition or a net zero objective. Just like the National Hydrogen Mission, I think the industry, I think, awaits the details on these, because I think that's what's going to be absolutely critical. So while I think the target is good and the target is meaningful, it'll be interesting to see how the different ministries get together and come up with exactly what is this investment or this outlay going to be used for. So I think those are kind of top of the mind thoughts. I think there were some benefits for battery manufacturing and viability gap funding for batteries and so on. As an industry, we always look for more. So I sit here saying, I wish there'd been a little bit more for battery VGF and for battery manufacturing. But given that, the finance minister has to juggle priorities across, 20 different sectors, I fully understand. But I think it's a good start overall.
Right. Thank you, Srivatsanji. Puneetji, your comments on this?
Yeah, definitely. See, when we talk about reaching a net zero, say by 2070, which was been mentioned quite well in this budget, I would say there are basically four pillars for getting a net zero. It starts with how you replace the coal, how you replace the oil, how you go for a better grid, and how your industrial development grows around green.
Right.
I was really surprised that all these four pillars were well addressed. When I talk about replacement of coal, So they talk about renewable energy, stationary batteries. They talk about the green hydrogen, green ammonia, everything they basically touch upon. When we talk about replacement of the oil, so again, it comes of the EV batteries. There is a PLI scheme already announced. Hydrogen PLI scheme again got around 20,000 crores of rupees. The third is a new grid, as Mr. Iyer has said. Again, good to see 20,000 crores has been put getting electricity from Ladakh. So, and the last but not the least is the how the industry is getting around with this new energy mix. And it is basically been all this four. But once you go a little bit more detail into this one, you basically see again the replacement policy of vehicle is coming. So if this comes, this will again go, the people will go for the new kind of EVs. So all aspects in this net zero is been covered. And I'm really thrilled that at least we are into this sector, and we are one of the, the minister has told that the fifth Rishi, which is Saptarishi, is the green growth.
Green growth. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Puneetji. Devashiji, your thoughts on it?
Quite heartening to see, as other panelists are saying, that one of the pillars is green growth, and first time probably a particular section was given to green, so that's pretty heartening. And not only a section, a lot of specific budgetary provision has been made.
Right.
And you know that country had only 34 gigawatt of renewable capacity in 2014. We have come a long way, but the entire growth in the renewable sector has come by supplying to the utilities, public utilities. But going forward, the growth of renewable, what India has committed, 450, 500 gigawatt by 2030, it will come from two segments. One is dispatchable renewable, which will be backed by storage, and they've covered both battery storage and pumped hydro storage.
Right.
And second aspect is, if India is trying 5 million metric ton per annum of hydrogen, that itself will take around 125 to 130 gigawatt of capacity, renewable capacity.
Right.
So these two segments are very critical to India achieving 500 gigawatt, and that itself will help India in 5 MMTPA of hydrogen itself will replace around 0.8 million barrel per day of fossil fuel import.
Right.
So the entire journey towards net zero, it's important that we achieve the first target of 2030.
Right.
And this really gives the country to achieve the 2030 targets. So that way, I'm quite excited with the provision.
Right. Devasji, I'll start with you. And if we get into some details. Now, as Srivasanji mentioned, the 35,000 crore outlay. Now, there were not explicitly, a lot of things were not explicitly mentioned, be it solar, wind, or any of the PLI schemes. But it has been read out that, this will be allocated for energy transition, net zero objectives, and energy security as well. And in fact, when the finance minister was reading it, she said that this will be through the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, which drew a lot of attention at that moment when she was said. So your reading as to where this could be allocated when we talk about these three objectives of energy transition, net zero objectives, and energy security.
I think my reading is that, the country has a huge potential to do biofuels.
Mm-hmm.
And, most of the biofuel projects are being pioneered, researched by the OMCs and public sector oil companies. So one of the reasons probably, they are making MOPNG the ministry to handle this, it will be that could be one leg of it. But even otherwise, if you look at it, what are the OMCs doing right now? They are basically providing transportation solution.
Right.
And these are basically by petrol, diesel, that kind of solution. But, fast forward 10 years, the same OMCs will be probably providing CNG, LNG, which they are again starting now. The transition will be through CNG and LNG. India will be probably the only country which will go through that.
Right.
Third will be EVs, and fourth will be also hydrogen fuel cells.
Right.
So the entire transportation market in India will probably in the 30s will have dependence on all the four categories.
Right.
And on the supply side, it will be renewable, biofuel, and all those things. So the transition will be most dramatically felt by these, companies which are under MOPNG. So my intelligent guess is that, but as other panelists have said, it will be good to
Have more
see the
details.
finer details and what their intentions are, because the amount is pretty high. So 35,000 crores is a pretty high number for 1 year. So yeah.
Right. Srivatsanji, your comments on this?
I think Debashish has probably described it just right. I mean, my again hypothesis is, while there is a good roadmap for the power and electricity sector to start to decarbonize in terms of having targets till 2030, in terms of having, I'd say, technology in place, right? I think the biggest issue with renewables, of course, is to have dispatchable renewables, but with the focus given on both utility size battery storage as well as pumped hydro, I think a combination of that with solar and wind, there is a roadmap at least for decarbonization of the power sector. To date, there is still no firm roadmap on decarbonization of the mobility sector, right? And that's actually one of the hard to abate sectors other than, industrial heating. So my guess is that's probably one of the reasons why the finance minister has allocated this to, be overseen by the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, because I think that's the next big challenge for India to take up, is how do you start to decarbonize? And again, in the budget, it's not just 35,000 crores, but it's also the additional funding given for the EV FAME. There's of course the phasing out of the the older vehicles and so on. So I think it's an integrated package that seems to give a focus on how do you start to clean up the mobility sector. And for those of us who live in Delhi over winters, we know exactly what that feels like.
Right. Thank you, Srivatsanji. Puneetji, in terms of, if you look at the budget allocations, solar definitely has seen some sort of rise compared to revised estimates of 2022-23. But wind saw, I think, 200 crore less than what it was when the revised estimates for 2022 and 3. But given how in 2022 there was a renewed focus on wind energy, especially offshore wind energy through policy initiative by the government, what is your reading on this in terms of whether there were expectations for the wind sector and did we miss it? And considering the allocation is also a little bit less this year.
See, as rightly has always been a demand for having a PLI in wind. Okay, but knowing the fact that it is always been taken as a backseat in India, knowing that there is a much more focus on solar compared to wind. Knowing the fact that, of course, the wind is a little bit more technological driven equipment. It not only depends upon the technology, but also the location with which it has to be placed. It is really getting scary in India. And in order to overcome all this, again, you need to go for a higher technology. And not the least is the development or the execution of the projects. So all these 3 or 4 things put together, in the last 3 to 4 years, if you see, the wind is a bit taken a back seat. But now going forward, what we see as a budget, of course, the one thing which is going forward when we talk about the hybrid projects coming and the RTC, because once we need to reach out to net zero, so we need to have a mixture of everything put together. So it is not only that solar alone can do that. It has to be mixed with wind, and both has to be mixed with the battery storage to get a RTC, or what we call as more than 80% of the utilization of the renewable energy all put together. So my view is that since we need to reach for this particular target, it has to grow progressively. And we can also see now when we are sitting on the day-to-day transition also, we see there is a huge amount of skewness happening now towards the wind sector, because once it comes to the scarcity of the area, the per hectares, what we talk about, the wind energy gives much more units than the solar. So these kind of activities going forward will basically take forward the wind in a right way.
Right. Debashish ji, if we talk about the battery incentives that have been given for the energy storage systems, Now, clearly, even at the World Economic Forum, our battery incentive programs were lauded, and pumped hydro storage in recent months have been quickly gaining a lot of traction. And as Puneet ji said, that the focus here is because of the takeoff that the government is expecting in round-the-clock power and hybrid projects. So if you could elaborate on the potential, probably more of the pumped hydro storage and then the takeoff that is expected in round-the-clock power and hybrid projects.
I think, there is a cost curve that was expected in terms of battery costs coming down. As per the, estimate, it was that, what was $140 will come down below $100, but because of COVID and other geopolitical disruption, that's not happening, and probably that's getting postponed by a couple of years. But at the same time, I think that also creates an opportunity for India to look at pumped hydro in a very serious manner.
Right.
And there are many companies. One particularly, stands out is probably Greenco, which is really doing some, innovative stuff around pumped hydro.
Okay.
And what's good about this thing is not only you can supply, round the clock green power, and that it's not greenwashing, it's truly green power round the clock as per your requirement. Because, during the daytime, you pump the water up and, use the potential to use it at the, evening peak or the morning peak, whenever you want it.
Right.
It also can be used in bringing down the cost of green hydrogen and, green ammonia, whatever you'll produce.
Right.
Because mind you, the biggest cost for producing today green hydrogen, green ammonia is the electrolyzer costs. And if you truly want to do green output, you need to have green source also. And if the, the utilization of electrolyzers are not round the clock, then it increases the cost.
Right.
So the only way you could, bring down the green hydrogen cost is to have some source which is complementing the, solar and wind source, and pumped hydro comes very handy at that stage. So it's a very good development that in the policy document also it is acknowledged, and that will, in fact, if you look at the economic survey also, that finds a mention. And I'm glad that, in terms of the sector development, this is a good thing that, we are focusing on it, and every state has that potential. So we should look at very seriously at it. So.
Right. Srivatsanji, your thoughts on it? I mean, clearly, one of the drawbacks that we've been hearing for some time when it comes to renewable projects was tackling their intermittency. And clearly, in recent months, storage systems have been the priority area for the government. What are your thoughts on this?
No, I think both the panelists have described it very well. If you're looking at long duration storage, which you would need, you need hybrid projects. I think the panelists already mentioned, you need solar and wind. In spite of that, you're going to have to need at least for, I'd say, if your target is 85% RTC at least, which is going to be the norm going forward, you're going to need one form of the storage or the other, which leads us to the zone of 4 to 6 hours storage needed at least to be able to meet, I'd say, an 85% target. For that, today's, pumped hydro is a more economical alternative than battery storage. Not to say that if, the costs of batteries keep declining, which we expect, which may not have happened the last couple of years, at some point in the future, battery storage may become, I'd say, equivalent to a pumped hydro. It's very good to see that the budget has already addressed pumped hydro, and has a framework for it. I think Greenco is really leading, and I think some of the public sectors are entering that space as well, building pumped hydro. So all, I think, really important developments in India. The good thing about pumped hydro is, or I'd say, no, I wouldn't say the good thing. The feature of pumped hydro is you have to build it on scale. And so not each IPP needs to build a pumped hydro, because when you build it, you have to build it of a certain minimum scale, which can then be shared across multiple projects, because you're not going to build a tiny pumped hydro at any given time. I think the one area of caution for us as a country is, given what we are seeing in Uttarakhand with land subsidence and so on, I think the ecological issues related with, any kind of a pumped hydro project, I'd say any hydro project, really have to be delved into in great detail going forward, because the land subsidence issues related to this won't be apparent for another 2 to 3 decades, right? So it's very easy to say, hey, we've done this for 2 years, everything is fine, let's move on, right? So I think that needs to be balanced as well. Though I'm heartened to see that there is a focus on pumped hydro as well as battery storage, because eventually, if you have to decarbonize the entire power sector, you need both of these to work in tandem with solar and wind hybrid.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Vatsanji. And my last question to all of you, that how from here on the trajectory for green hydrogen looks like. Mr. Iyer, we had the opportunity to talk when the policy came out in January, and you mentioned a lot of things, the evacuation of renewable power through robust transmission system. Clearly that also got mentioned in the speech. But if we look at the allocation this year, it's around 297 crores. And if we look at the speech that the Finance Minister made, it was more or less just what the National Hydrogen Policy was unveiled on January 4th. So what next for green hydrogen in terms of, we talked about demand creation, the purchase obligations. What next for the trajectory?
So I'll go to one of the pain points of the sector, actually. So if you look at green hydrogen, 60% of the cost of green hydrogen is the cost of electricity. About 20% is the cost or the capex related to the electrolyzer, and the others is everything else put together is the rest of the 20%. If you don't address the cost of the input electricity, it's going to be very hard for green hydrogen to compete either with conventional hydrogen, gray hydrogen in areas where like fertilizers and refining, but also very hard for green hydrogen to compete with natural gas in heating applications or with diesel, for example, in heavy duty mobility. So if you have to decarbonize the entire sector, green hydrogen has the technical potential to do all of that. However, cost of electricity today, renewable electricity in India, unfortunately, is kind of held back a little by both BCD and ALMM, right? So at least as a sector, we were really hoping to see a little bit of relief, if not at least a deferment of some of these till the domestic sector actually catches up. And at the same time, I'd love to see at some point a sunset date for the BCD, right? Because BCD is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Domestic modules will be priced at import parity with BCD added on it. And if you're going to tag on 40% import tariffs to modules, your cost of electricity is always going to be held high. So what we really need is a concerted push to make sure that we drop the cost of renewable energy for the country, while at the same time making sure that we have supply security, because solar module is, I think, a sector of national interest. So it's the national interest to make sure that a robust manufacturing system be built in India. However, it has to be built with the right economics. It cannot be built under economics that makes renewable energy expensive for the country, as well as holds back the development of green hydrogen.
Right. Thank you, Srivatsanji. Puneetji, your thoughts on it?
See, for me, it's just a starting, which is hydrogen, and I'm really grateful that at least the things have started moving into the direction. Which way it is going to take, it is yet, as Mr. Iyer has stated, is a long way to go as on date, because 60%, knowing it is 60% cost, still goes with the for the electricity of this. Many of the countries where during the daytime, where the electricity is really free, it is available at the zero cost. We have not yet come to that place, because although if you see the FY24 the projection for the electricity also, we are in the growing phase, and it will grow to that level. So being that, how it is going to fare, it is very difficult for me to say, but it's good way that we started talking about hydrogen and its usage. And specifically not only for the industrial as well as for the automobile sector and other things also.
Right. Thank you. Devashiji, your thoughts on it?
No, I'm quite excited, and you don't right now. Increasingly budgets should become a non-event, and policy announcements should happen at periodic intervals. If you look at the 2 hydrogen policies that have come out, it will be between the 2 budgets.
Right.
So I'm sure that subsequently they will announce the purchase obligation if the refineries and petrochemical unit, the CGDs and the fertilizer unit start buying green hydrogen. It will start the activity, And it is heartening to see even in the economic survey, they have put out a chart quoting Niti Aayog to say that how the green hydrogen cost curve will pan out. It says it is currently around $5.50, and the gray hydrogen around $1.7 to $2.5, but it crosses around 2030 around $1.72, and then it goes down below gray hydrogen, and then it picks up. And that's the phase where the hard to abate sectors will come in. But it's very easy to now go for green ammonia and encourage. And how when Prime Minister Modi was the CM of Gujarat, started procuring solar power at 15 rupees. And that actually, started the entire thing of, once you get into that ecosystem, you'll start manufacturing, and, the cost curve will come down. So I'm very hopeful that in next 12 months, the activities will start and India will start actually producing. And even if we produce at $5.50 also, so be it. But, that's for that, the viability gap will be there and all that. So I'm very hopeful. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Devasji, and thank you all the panelists for your time this afternoon and for sharing your thoughts, your insights in this post-budget session on the provisions related to green growth and how they will accelerate, give that impetus to India's renewable energy transition drive, and of course, its net zero commitments by 2070. Thank you once again for joining